We start this week by looking at a visit that the US academic from Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Noam Chomsky, made to Britain last week. He was in London talking about how the hopes of the post-war world have been slowly crushed at something called the British Academy. Martin, tell us a little bit about Noam Chomsky, because I noticed him pop up on Newsnight with Evan Davis, and Evan Davis was saying, well, you know, you don't really have any people sort of supporting or following you, but of course he does in the intellectual world, doesn't he?
He does. Well, he's actually a linguistic theorist, and his linguistic theories are why he's a professor in the first place, but he's more well known for being a hardline critic of US foreign policy. I think it's fair to say that. Yeah,
he's involved in the anti-war movement in Vietnam, apparently.
Yeah,
as well.
it was from that. It was that era when he first came to prominence, and he was one of the many intellectual voices in the university system in the US who began to question their government's foreign policy goals and tactics.
And what's your understanding about the links between him being an anarchist, anarcho-syndicalist, apparently, and the linguistics?
Well, this is a bit tendentious. I mean, his linguistic theories, in fact, have actually come under some challenge in recent years, I understand, because he basically said that we've all got a fundamental grammar in our minds, which is before we even start learning languages. But I think some modern linguistics theorists are questioning that. But I mean, that's a very specialist topic.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because, you know, a baby can be born in one part of the world, another part of the world. They'll come out with different words, but actually what they're doing with those words and connecting them with the outside world is a similar thing, isn't it?
Yeah, well, this is, as I understand it, I'm not a great expert on Chomsky's linguistic theories. He was pointing out that, you know, there are some fundamental grammars which are hardwired into the human brain. I understand that others, I mean, this is the thing about proper science, others have come forward and said, no, that's a delusion. In actual fact, they're not hardwired.
Well, it's good. It's a good discussion.
It's an interesting discussion. But of course, he gained his tenure as a professor on the back of that. But in actual fact, he's also, I mean, he is very thorough in the kind of social science research that he does. You know, he knows an awful lot about an awful lot of things. I'm not 100% in agreement with Chomsky myself, but then who is 100% with anybody else?
One of the things he was talking about when he was at the British Academy last week, which I found, seeing him on Newsnight, I thought, well, this was a bit of he was saying, for example, some pretty interesting stuff like the poorest 70% of the population get absolutely no say in any policy whatsoever, so that you can't really call it a democracy when only the richest 30% are deciding which way the society is going.
He's picking up there on a study by social scientists in the US, I've forgotten the name of them, pointing out that in actual fact the influence of the average person on policy in the United States is minimal.
When he's saying it's the same here.
Well, effectively, if we think about it, we have a system very similar to that in the Roman Republic, which was ostensibly a democracy for men in the Roman Republic, for men and women for us, but in actual practice, wealthy patricians like Julius Caesar, Pompey, whatever, they were the fixers behind the scenes. They bought and sold votes. Some people's votes are worth more than others, and so on. And in actual fact, we've got a plutocracy stroke oligarchy. And I don't think there's really much doubt about that. I mean, if you objectively looked at it, if you came from Mars and had a look at our society and the way it runs, you would say, well, this is basically an oligarchy with some democratic features. It's not a democracy at all.
Well, isn't aren't the some democratic features there really as a way to hoodwink the public into thinking that
indeed, that's why I was thinking of the Roman Republic as my model, because in theory everybody in the Roman Republic was equal. In practice, there was a huge gulf between those who were at the top of the pile and those who were at the bottom.
It sounds very George Orwell. Some are more equal than others. And actually, Chomsky was talking about homage to Catalonia, saying that, you know, he was bringing out some of the points from that in his talk. But his main point about linguistics and and anarchism was, I thought, a fascinating one. When he was saying basically that humans have something, people nowadays talk about humans as sort of, well-evolved animals, but he's saying actually there's a complete separation, total difference between humans and animals, and that is their ability with language and creativity through language, and that ability, and that's why he said that's why he found linguistics such an attractive and interesting thing to get involved with. And he's saying that any kind of system that oppresses that creativity is de facto wrong, and he sees a lot of the political systems as actually, they're ultimately restricting the creativity of individuals, basically taking over their time to do work for others, etc., and restricting individual creativity. What do you think of that?
Well, I broadly would agree with it. My disagreements with Noam Chomsky would be on rather specific things. For example, the 9/11 attacks, in which he basically just said, I'm not interested in discussing this. He's quite able to discuss the military-industrial complex in the US, whatever, but when it comes to specifics, he doesn't want to make specific allegations. And I would contrast Noam Chomsky, for example, with Michel Chossudovsky, who is an academic in Canada, who's much more prepared to talk about specific crimes by the elite, not just talk about their crimes in a general kind of a way. And I think that's the difference between Noam Chomsky's softball and Chossudovsky's ice hockey.
Okay. What about the point I made right at the start, though, about it's 70 years since the kind of end game was playing out of the Second World War? That is between middle of 1944 and early 1945. There were deals being done between the Allies and the Nazis, allegedly. The Nazis having quite a lot of gold as chips up their sleeve, and also, of course, they'd had a nuclear weapons program that started even before the US Manhattan Project. So they'd gone some way down the line to developing nuclear weapons, and there's some pretty strong evidence that they had enriched uranium, possibly even plutonium, with which to deal with the Americans and the British at that time.
Well, I think it's pretty common knowledge that the OSS, the then forerunner of the CIA, had a pretty intimate relationship both with the Gestapo in Germany and with the Kemputai in Japan. And if you stand back and look at it objectively, you can see why that might be. As the war comes to an end game, there are various, the Allies are going to win. We're now moving into a new situation, a Cold War with the Soviet Union. And therefore, in actual fact, what we're trying to do is salvage useful bits of the fascist system in Germany and Japan in order to help us dominate the ongoing world order after the war. And I think the evidence, Operation Paperclip, was moving large numbers of scientists and others into the US and into Latin America. And of course, it wasn't just scientists, it was also intelligence officers such as Reinhard Gehlen, head of the Gestapo in Eastern Europe, who ends up heading the BND, the West German intelligence services. Well, which sends a very clear signal to the Russians, doesn't it? The head of the Gestapo is now running our intelligence services.
Well, it's also, but the relevance for today is that some of this stuff has taken quite a long time to come out. It was just literally last month there was something in the New York Times, and which made the newspapers all over the world about 1,000 Nazis actually being given new identities and being recruited into the CIA and actually having pensions. So, you've got this situation where the US government is actually funding ex-Nazis who've been protected from prosecution, whilst, thousands, they may be walking down the sidewalk with homeless people sleeping, on cardboard boxes.
Well, and interestingly enough, the Russians had a proposal at the UN General Assembly a couple of weeks ago condemning the glorification of Nazism. And it was an uncontroversial proposal. It was passed by, I think, about 154 countries voted in favour of it. 55 countries abstained, including Britain. But 3 countries refused to vote to condemn the glorification of Nazism. And those 3 countries were US, Canada and Ukraine. And of course the Ukraine voted against the banning the glorification of Nazis because many of the people in the current coalition in Kiev are openly pro-Nazi.
Yes, that article in the New York Times did cause a bit of a stir, and I think, in a way, it's some of the ramifications of it are just now being known. But in a way, it seems it's a little bit like this child sexual abuse Westminster scandal. It's okay to talk about these things once the perpetrators are all dead.
Well, I think what happens is there is a kind of catch-up time before people realise what's been going on. But of course what's happening with modern technology, the internet, etc., is that catch-up time is getting shorter and shorter. And of course it's so much easier now for people to research anything that they want to research. So when I mentioned Operation Paperclip earlier, anybody can just do a search on their computer and they'll get all sorts of information about Operation Paperclip. Back in the 1970s, when I was a lad, to research something like that would have involved all sorts of traipsing into libraries, getting things up from the stack, writing to professors and getting them to write back to you. It took ages. Now, of course, we're able to put the pieces of the jigsaw together much faster. The main problem now is information overload. There's too much information and nobody's quite sure where to start looking.
Well, if we're zooming in on this particular subject today, and we had on this show a couple of years ago, didn't we, John Loftus, who was Jimmy Carter's FBI special prosecutor. Jimmy Carter gave him permission to go through everything in the US intelligence archives and to dig out evidence of Americans that had been helping and hiding Nazi war criminals.
Well, I mean, I think it was a decision at the highest levels to integrate elements of the Nazi intelligence structure into the very founding structures of NATO. And I would argue that the Gladio structures in NATO, there's one to look at, people, I keep mentioning it, you can just do a search and you'll find it. The Gladio structures were set up in the 1940s using fascist and Nazi intelligence personnel. I don't think there's any doubt about that. This is not conspiracy theory, it's just historical fact. And if you think about it for 2 seconds, it's perfectly logical why that should have happened in some respects, and it's still going on. I mean, the linkages between between the Western intelligence services and the far-right groups in the Ukraine, such as the Pravi Sector and Svoboda, which was previously named something else, these linkages go back to the 1940s. And the Russians have been pointing this out and using whatever platforms they can find to just try and get the Western public opinion to understand how it appears from their perspective. And
John Loftus put it all together in a book called America's Nazi Secret, which is quite a fascinating read. One of the things he told us about was about the British king who'd abdicated. Which one was Edward VII, who abdicated, and Mrs. Simpson, who was apparently a Nazi agent before the war. He said he came across records showing that they had actually tried to cross into occupied Europe in order to go and work for the Nazis. That's the ex-British king.
Well, indeed. And of course, Prescott Bush, who was the grandfather of George W. Bush, was the Nazis' main financial agent on Wall Street, and was eventually arrested during World War II and charged with dealing with the enemy, although he had brilliant lawyers, as you can imagine, and he got off. But I don't think there's any doubt about it. The senior people in the US were definitely involved in helping to finance the Nazi Party. The US corporations had quite a lot of money invested in Nazi Germany, and they were quite keen for those investments to be protected, and they saw the Nazis as the guys to do it. And I don't think anybody really can dispute this. It's not as if we're making this up. This was the case, and during the war, these kind of linkages continued to be quietly kept open. Montague Norman, who was the head of the Bank of England, ensured that Germany's debts were rolled over in the Bank of International Settlement, because as a central banker, he thought, well, at the end of the war we'll have to pick up the pieces, so we'll carry on doing deals with them in behind the scenes. Martin Bormann, quite possibly, according to Paul Manning's book, rescued by the Western Intelligence Service, specifically the British, because he was the money man for the Nazis. He knew where all the gold was and all the various financial resources and those financial resources, of course, became the slush fund, which was the basis of Gladio, which then carried out various terrorist attacks in Western Europe and in Eastern Europe in the Ukraine. So, I mean, all of this stuff is not you and me making this up. This is, in fact, the historical record.
And I think, actually, in years to come, this will be seen as, quite an important strand of history, which for 70 years was pretty much stamped on. There is, of course, the book OpJB, Operation James Bond, by Christopher Creighton, which is actually a pseudonym for a chap who was involved in, at least he says, in actually helping Martin Bormann to escape from Nazi Germany with a kind of tiny cell at the very top of MI6. So it wasn't the whole of MI6 involved. It was just a few people with commandos.
Morton, who was
Desmond Morton,
who was the model for C in the James Bond books, because of course Ian Fleming was John Ainsworth-Davis, Christopher Creighton's line manager in this operation. And of course Paul Manning's book, who was a US journalist, he didn't go into the detail of how Bormann escaped, but he definitely did escape, and he ended up in Argentina with the knowledge and support of the Western intelligence services. So people like Klaus Barbie, for example, were spirited out of Germany, ended up in Latin America, and were brought in by the CIA to train the Bolivian army in torture techniques during the 1960s when they were fighting guerrillas led by Che Guevara. So, I mean, again, this is all historical record, not conspiracy theory. And once people have understood the historical record, then they can get a better grasp on what might be going on now.
So it's a bit James Bond in terms of it being the part of the Secret Service, but it's a tiny cell of the Secret Service, very, very close to the king, the government, and so that is to say Winston Churchill, the king involved, is King George VI. Ian Fleming, you mentioned, and I think it's quite clear that his books that he wrote after World War II were, I mean, obviously he couldn't write about it because it was all official secrets, so there was a lot of hints in some of the James Bond books.
Well, I mean, James Bond himself was named after Operation James Bond, and Fleming, in fact, there's a letter from Fleming and a letter from Mountbatten and a letter from Churchill to John Ainsworth-Davis, which are reproduced in his book, in which they say, when we are all dead, you can tell everybody what was really going on. And I think Ainsworth-Davis, who died recently, wasn't very happy, because what they were being told is that they were rescuing Bormann so that they could track down all of the Nazi money, and then the money would be given back to the people it had been stolen from, which of course was not the case. The money was just being transferred to other purposes.
Well, I mentioned at the top of the hour the NTV programme, which is a Russian network, which has been recorded over the last month or so, which can be shown in the new year in Russian, about all this. And they went over to Buenos Aires to interview Lawrence de Mello, who we've had on this programme a couple of times. Now, one of the things she said is when she first arrived, she's an English journalist who lives in Buenos Aires. When she first arrived there, they were talking about the Nazis next door, that actually this was quite a common thing. So why was Argentina a sort of natural haven for Nazis after World War II?
Well, because the Peronist regime in Argentina, which is fairly anti-Anglo-American, had seen the Germans as potential allies, so there was that element to it. But in any case, it was a very don't forget the Catholic connection, the Vatican, the rat lines. A lot of the Croatian fascists.
Wasn't there also a Nazi party in Argentina during the war?
There was.
I mean, I've seen pictures of Nazi rallies in Argentina.
There was, but I think the real issue is that they couldn't leave them in Western Europe. They had to go somewhere, and the Latin American dictatorships was the obvious place for them to go. So they didn't just go to Argentina. A lot of them ended up in Paraguay. And Bolivia and places like that. Barbie, as I say, ended up to training the Bolivian army in torture techniques, and it was just a place to park them all, where they were out of the purview of journalists in Western Europe and the US.
Anyway, back to Christopher Creighton. Actually, his real name John Ainsworth-Davis, in his book OpJB, The Last Great Secret of the Second World War. Fascinating read. It's about 220 pages, but it's really quite gripping stuff. And if it's true, and of course there is more and more evidence coming to light that it is true, that this guy with his checkbooks, all the Nazi checkbooks for all of the loot that was looted from the Second World War, was actually brought over to the UK. That was done through this organisation COP, who were commandos. Now, a little bit like the Lysander aircraft used to fly across and drop spies in and land in a field, quickly bring somebody out in occupied Europe during the Second World War, and then come back, for example, to Western Zoyland Airfield, just down here in Somerset, those aircraft. The COP commandos would be dropped off by ship and would actually penetrate quite deeply sometimes into occupied Europe along rivers. waiting it until when it came light, but it started to become light early in the morning. They'd get out their canoes, hide in the woods for a little while, and then when it started to become dark again, and then they go further in, then they would bring people and packages and that sort of thing in and out of occupied Europe. And so that's basically what this is about. And John Ainsworth-Davis allegedly went on that mission and told the story to snatch Martin Bormann right in March 1945, just before the end of the Second World War, right out from under the noses of the Russians. So anyway, got a little treat for you now, Martin, and it's a short clip from Lawrence de Mello of John Ainsworth-Davis himself speaking about the whole idea of having a double for Martin Bormann, which he talks about in the book.
We took this double, and the reason for it was the Bormann double was to kill him and leave Bormann free to travel. We took Bormann out, and the other chap was blown to pieces.
Just a little tiny clip there, but this is the sort of thing that Lawrence is working on and getting out through the press. I mean, there's more and more evidence coming out about this. But ultimately, what then happened to all that loot? Because Paul Manning, in a way, you've got two sections to this. You've got the OpJB book, which John Ainsworth-Davis, who died earlier this year, was involved in the actual operation of getting Bormann out. But then once he was in South America, the Manning book takes over and explains about the 750 corporations that he set up and the money laundering through Sullivan and Cromwell.
Yes, I mean, I think the two books are complementary because Ainsworth-Davis explains the practical details of removing Bormann, and of course Berlin is a notorious. It's got lots of canals and lakes, so it was very good for water-based commandos to operate in. And then, of course, what happened after the war is that the whole thing was based upon a meeting at the Red House in Strasbourg, if you remember, Tony, where
that was August 1944.
August 1944, where Bormann, who was the real brains behind the Nazi Party, got together with the industrialists and said, "Look, we're going to lose the war. We need to get the money out, and we need to start doing deals with the Allies behind the scenes," and set off to do exactly that. Of course, Hitler was still saying we're going to fight to the end, etc., etc. Bormann was Hitler's fixer or gopher, and he was, of course, basically, knew that the game was up, and he was doing deals behind the scenes with the Western intelligence services.
Okay, and also we hope to be talking with Lawrence de Mello over the next few weeks a bit more about this, because we're kind of in the middle of that period between that August 1944, the Red House meeting, the decisions by the Nazis to bury their treasure, and the end of the Second World War. But anyway, let's go back now, I think, to talk about what we were originally saying, which is about Noam Chomsky, looking at what happened after World War II to labour movements and that sort of thing, and also, of course, to the partisans, because there was actually quite an effective partisan movement, particularly in northern Italy, places like Yugoslavia, that the Allies didn't actually really like, even though they'd, in some places, totally defeated the Nazis.
Well, I mean, things started to change. I mean, E.P. Thompson, the famous British historian who wrote The Making of the English Working Class in the 1960s, very influential history book, his brother...
Being spied on, by the way, by MI6.
Well, of course. I mean, his brother Frank...
We heard recently.
His brother Frank Thompson was actually parachuted into Bulgaria as a partisan liaison officer with a radio operator. In a pamphlet written many years afterwards, E.P. Thompson, Edward Thompson, pointed the finger at the OSS, the forerunner of the CIA, as having grassed up his brother to the Gestapo, so that he was then tortured to death by the Gestapo over several days. The radio operator was treated as a prisoner of war under the Geneva Convention. His brother wasn't. His brother was a multilinguistic person. That's why he was parachuted in, but he was also a convinced communist. And at one stage of the war, of course, the Western intelligence services were quite happy to work with communist partisans in Yugoslavia and in Italy and other places. And then later on in the war, of course, the attitude changed. When the changeover took place, I think it was Fitzroy Maclean was saying that Churchill was asked, well, we shouldn't be switching to support the communists in Yugoslavia. I mean, we should be supporting the nationalists, the right wing, the Chetniks. We don't want to be supporting the communists. But the communists were doing the most of the fighting. That was the reason. And Churchill apparently turned around to whoever had asked the question and said, "Do you intend to live in Yugoslavia after the war?" And they said no. And he said, "Neither do I."
Okay. Also, the whole business of the sort of post-war era really has been affected by this, hasn't it? Because the picture, for example, of Northern Italy would have been very different if the partisans had been allowed. The American troops had just sort of gone round the partisan-controlled cities and left them alone and gone on to fight, up in southern Germany.
Well, it's worse than that. Lucky Luciano was actually released from prison in New York. He was a mob leader in New York in order to facilitate the Allied landings in Sicily, and then also to help in further. As they advanced up the boot of Italy. And in fact, it was quite possible that the communists who had opposed Mussolini, opposed Hitler, opposed the war, were going to do very well in any free election in Italy after the war. And the way of dealing with that by the OSS and MI6 was to work very closely with the mafia. So they were very keen to put the mafia in control in Italy as they took power. And I think, again, this is all on the record. There's been on BBC Two documentaries about the relationships between Western intelligence services and the mafia. And that explains an awful lot about why Italy ended up being dominated by the mafia after the war.
Interesting.
Because it was policy.
And interesting that we were hearing from Susan Lindauer how the mafia were doing very, very well out of dealing with the American intelligence services over Lockerbie. And this is much more recently, but it seems there's a very, very close relationship between the official kind of mafiosi around the world, drug dealers, big international drug dealers, and our security services. But what I want to really talk about with relation to World War II was I'm starting to think maybe actually this was all just about people hanging on to their power, to their control and to their big industrial empires, that there wasn't any real fear of communism from an ideological point of view. The Germans and the Brits all once said, well, after the war we want to make sure we hang on to our nice little earners because these various income streams, industries that we own allow us, means that we never have to work again. We've got fantastic amounts of money and wealth, and actually it wasn't really an ideological difference. They just didn't want the people to get their hands on these big industries.
Well, and in fact the communists provided them with a convenient excuse for keeping hold of their power. Because the communist system as practiced in the Soviet Union wasn't terribly attractive really to many people, and therefore if they could be turned into the big bogeyman, that would suit everybody. But of course, as Noam Chomsky will point out, the idea that Russia and the Soviet Union in 1945, a devastated country that had lost 20 million casualties and had its industry completely destroyed, was in a position to fight the Western powers was ludicrous. They were never in a position to threaten the West. But they were a useful bogeyman.
Out of the Second World War came a kind of a radical democratic spirit around the world, all over, and in Europe and in the United States, everywhere. And the first task of the victors, the United States and Britain, was to crush it. In Europe, they had to crush the partisans. The first actions of the British and American armies were to crush the partisan movements, which were basically radical democratic, and that was intolerable. And this was incidentally under the British Labour Party. When the British forces moved up to northern Italy, British and American forces, they discovered a functioning society. The Italian partisans were a strong movement. They had essentially driven out the Nazis. The British and the Americans had to destroy them. They had developed a cooperative, functioning society. The British Labour Party was appalled at the fact that workers were managing their own firms without bosses telling them what to do. That was completely unacceptable. And the Americans, of course, even more so. So in Italy and Greece, similar things in France, even in Germany. One of the reasons for breaking Germany up into two sections, which is expressed by George Kennan, one of the leading architects of the post-war world, was that it was necessary to wall Western Germany away from the East. Interesting turn of phrase. The problem was that in the East there were radical labor-based movements developing, and the West had to be protected from that. So we had to wall it off from the Eastern influences. This went on all over Europe. And the same was happening at home.
Well, I think that's interesting speeches from Noam Chomsky about what happened at the end of the war, confirming a lot of the speculation and chat that we were having before that clip.
I mean, I remember, for example, looking at 1955, there was an enormous, massive amount of population involved in the railway industry in Britain, and there was a strike by railway workers in 1955, just before the general election. And as a result of that, they had a state of emergency, actually, just for a few days, because then they went back to work. But because the railways, everyone was so dependent on the railways and the railway unions, and the strike was only over the price of a packet of cigarettes, apparently, a week. But it was a matter of principle for the unions, and there was a sort of face-off. But slowly but surely, these big industries, which were heavily unionised, with very good pay and conditions, that sort of thing, have been slowly broken, not least of which the mining industry and the miners' strike of the 1980s.
Yeah, well, I mean, obviously, what actually happened after World War II, because of the existence of a communist threat, real or imagined, was that the powers that be were prepared to make compromises with the wider society. Unions did have a place. They didn't try to break them. A policy of full employment was pursued, for example. The Marshall Plan massively injected money into the Western European economy in order to try and stabilise the situation. And there was a kind of a policy of, in order to prevent a communist revolution, we're prepared to make social reform a reality. But of course, after the 1970s, 1980s, the ruling class in the West decided they'd had enough of that, and they wanted to go back to the old system where they just had 100% power. And with the collapse of the Soviet Union in 91, they really got onto their stride, and therefore they've pushed a super free market policy in the subsequent era, which we've not seen since the 1920s, with disastrous results.
Super free market policy, but it's not really a free market. It's a bunch of cartels.
No, well, that's what I suppose. If we're not really using, it's a question of what words we're using here. But the point is that they're not prepared to make social compromises. That's clearly what I mean. The current crisis is a result of a break with what was called in Britain the Butskellite consensus, which was that both Labour and Tory governments would work within a general consensus about keeping unemployment down, protecting wages, and so forth. But that's all gone.
The communist threat, actually, it seems to me, was nothing to do with anything military. It was just the ideas that people might actually start taking over industries and this kind of thing, rather than having a handful of almost feudal barons taking them over, controlling them, and getting the people to work as serfs.
As we said earlier, there was never any real prospect of an invasion of Western Europe by the Soviet Union. The real threat was always ideological.
Ultimately, what happened to all this Nazi loot then that went through South America? I mean, we've talked in the past about Paul Manning, the former CBS news correspondent during World War II in Europe's book, which is Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile. But he created 750 companies, didn't he? So the impression is, anyway, that many of these Nazis, many of them also war criminals, just simply took off their Nazi uniforms and put suits on and walked into the post-war world as businessmen.
Indeed. So where did the money go? Well, it went into rebuilding West German industries as it then was.
Okay, ultimately, any way of identifying where this is going to go? Because it certainly seems that there is a fascistic influence today, I mean, not least of which making disabled people and people who are very vulnerable in our society right now pay for the crimes of the banking sector. Where are we heading?
Well, I mean, the use of the word fascist to describe things like that is slightly overdone, I think. The real problem is in the Ukraine, where you do have openly fascist forces who are engaged in ethnic cleansing in the East Ukraine and massacres of protesters and so forth in the West Ukraine, with the full support of the liberal members of NATO. That is the place where we really need to consider the implications of what we've been talking about.
Getting bigger by being better. The number one choice for Bristol. This is BCFM 93.2.